Okay, hi everybody, and welcome to part 2 of our pre-Pesach series of adult education. We are thrilled today to have Dena Weiss, who is the Director of Full-Time Immersive Programs at the Hadar Institute in New York. She teaches Talmud, Midrash, and Hasidut. She is in Israel now. She thought she was going for a very brief time and has been there for a year and a half. Dena's title today is Enslaving Ourselves, a New Look at the Exodus. And everybody's here to see you and listen and learn with you, Dena, so I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. It's nice to see everybody with power. You know, it really is not that many days have passed. I'm sure that you're all still reeling from the after effects of the power outage and all those storms. So it's just a relief to see everybody, you know, up and running again. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to, instead of focus on the end of the story, which is usually the focus of the Passover Seder, right? Usually the Passover Seder starts with the point of we are going to see ourselves emerging from Egypt, right? That's our kind of psychological, emotional point of departure. We are free people. Look at how far we've come from slavery, right? But of course, there's a moment, there's a stage before that, right? And the stage before that is, well, how did we become slaves in the first place, right? Instead of asking, how do we emerge out of slavery, I want to ask a kind of preliminary question, which is, how did we get into slavery? And this question is, we're going to start in a kind of, I use the term historical loosely, so let's say biblical. We'll start in the biblical place, right, of asking, how did the Israelites get into their physical bondage? And we're going to use that as a kind of metaphor or example of the kinds of psychological bondage that we find ourselves in today. Okay, so we're going to be talking about our historical selves as slaves in Egypt. We're also going to be talking about our current selves and the ways in which we are not free, but aren't free of our own volition, meaning we get ourselves into these situations where we force ourselves to lose our freedom. Okay, I'm going to stop talking abstractly and I'm going to share my screen. You'll see that my screen has two tabs. There's the tab with the source sheet, and then there's the tab that will say questions. And I'm using the questions doc as a kind of whiteboard because I don't actually have a blackboard in my house. Again, nobody told me there was going to be a pandemic and I would have to, you know, be prepared to have a blackboard in my house. So, so we'll be using one tab as the blackboard and one tab as the source sheet. And I'm going to share both of those links with you in the chat so that you'll have them if you want to make a copy. In Google Docs, you can make a copy of any doc that you can see. So I would suggest if you're interested, you can make a copy of the whiteboard doc and use that to take notes, or make a copy of the source sheets, or both, or if you want to print them, whatever you want to do. So we're going to send you those links so that you are able to do whatever you need to do. Barbara, do you want to send those links or should I? It will be great for you. Yeah, it's good that I'm good at reading lips. Okay, great. So I'm going to share my screen and Barbara's going to chat out the links to both the source sheet and the high-tech whiteboard that we'll be using. Okay. So we're going to start with the Bible. We're going to start with the end of Breshit. And what I want you to do is shut off for just a moment your critical analytical way of reading text. And I want you to turn on your emotional, imaginative way of reading the text. Okay, so what you're going to do is you're not going to be trying to analyze the text. You're going to try to experience the story of the text. That's the first little shift that I'm going to ask you to make as we're reading through this text. And the second shift that I'm going to ask you to make, which might be more difficult is, instead of reading this text as an Israelite or as a descendant of the ancient Israelites, I want you to read this text, hear this text, experience this text from the vantage point of the Egyptians. Okay, pretend for a moment that this is not a piece of Torah, right? This is not something that you find in the Hebrew Bible. Pretend for a moment that this is the passage as it is written in the history books of ancient Egypt. Okay. So I am going to read, I'm going to do my best job to read, somewhat, narratively, somewhat emotionally. And you're going to do your best at trying to step into the text as an emotional experiencer of the text and as an Egyptian. Okay. So here we go. Joseph settled his father and his brothers and granted them a holding in the land of Egypt, in the best part of the land, in the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had instructed. I see, Barbara, you chatted out a link to this doc. Is this the doc for the whiteboard, or is this the doc for the source sheet, just so people know?
This is the doc for the source sheet.
Okay, great. Can you also now chat out the doc for the whiteboard?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. So here we are back in the text. Joseph settled his father and his brothers and granted them a holding in the land of Egypt, in the best part of the land, in the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had instructed. And Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with food, according to the number of their dependents. Now there was no food in all the land, for the famine was very severe. The land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. Joseph collected all the money to be found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan in exchange for the grain that they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. When the money from the land of Egypt and from the land of Canaan was spent, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? For our money is gone." And Joseph answered, "Give me your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock if your money is gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, and the donkeys. That year he supplied them with food in exchange for all of their livestock. When that year was ended, they came to him the following year and said to him, "We cannot hide from my lord that our money is all spent, and the herds of cattle are my lord's. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our lands. Shall we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land in exchange for food. We, with our land, will become slaves to Pharaoh. Just give us seed so that we may live and not die, and that the land may not become desolate." So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. All the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe upon them, and the land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he, that is Joseph, made slaves of them from one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore, they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, "Now that I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh, here is seed for you. Sow the land, and at the harvests you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field and as food for yourselves and your households, and as food for your little ones." They said, "You have saved our lives, may it please my lord. We will be slaves to Pharaoh." So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day, that Pharaoh should have of the fifth. The land of the priests alone did not become Pharaoh's. Thus, Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the region of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it, and were fruitful and multiplied exceedingly. Okay. So this is a story that I'm sure was familiar to all of you, that Joseph was in charge of the economic life of all of the Egyptians. But my question for you is, now that you've heard this story from an emotional place, right? And now that you've heard this story and listened to the story and experienced the story, not as an Israelite, but as an Egyptian, okay, I have two questions for you. The first question is, how do you feel about Joseph, right? How does Yosef now read to you as a character? And the second question is, how about Yosef's family? How do you feel about Yosef's family? Okay, so we have two separate questions, although I hope you could see that they're related, right? How do I, right, an Egyptian experiencer of this time in history, feel about Joseph? And how do I feel about Joseph's family? I see that Sarah has raised her hand. I'm going to give folks just a few seconds to think about this question. And also just to remind you that I don't know most of you, so I'm going to just call you by the name that you have written in your Zoom box, and I hope that I'm accurate and that I'm pronouncing it correctly. If you write down Marsha's iPad, I'm going to call you Marsha's iPad. So now you know. Okay. So we'll take just a few more seconds for folks to think through. You're an Egyptian experiencing the end of Sefer Bereshit. How do you feel about Joseph? How do you feel about Joseph's family? Okay, I see two hands. I'm going to take one more hand. So now's your chance, Jeopardy style, to ring the buzzer to be the third person to respond. Okay, we'll start with Sarah.
Okay. I think in the short term, one might be thankful to Joseph, but then learn to really hate him as the famine ceases, because you've just given up all of your money, all of your possessions, and your freedom. And I think you'd end up being very resentful of his family because, they were just given food and they're prospering.
Okay, good. So I think that you really hinted at two really important things, right? The first is that there's going to be this transition, right? Where at first I'm going to feel very grateful, and then that gratefulness might sour. You're also pointing out that I might feel grateful towards Joseph, but I have no reason to feel grateful towards his family, right? So whatever kind of complicated emotions I might have towards Joseph, I'm appreciative, but I'm resentful. He saved my life, but also now I'm a slave, right? All of those complex emotions where the negative is tinged by the positive, and I'm kind of waffling back and forth on how I feel, that doesn't apply to Joseph's family, right? I don't really have any reason to be grateful to them, right? So whatever resentment that I have towards Joseph might be as strong or even stronger towards his family without really anything to soften it, without anything to temper it. Okay, good. We're going to go to Rona Lesser.
I was going to just say basically what Sarah said, and I can add one more thing. Even the fact I would be resentful that they were given the best of the land, too.
Good. Right, so you're noticing another detail. It's not only that Joseph provided for his family, right, which is understandable. Joseph is providing the best for his family at the time that the Egyptians are becoming so poor that they're selling their land to Pharaoh and then becoming tenant farmers, right? So it's not only that the Israelites are secure and the Egyptians are insecure. It's that the gap between them is widening and widening and widening. Okay. We have time for one more person. Yes, Sanford.
Yeah, this is almost like an anti-Semitic story in the sense of Jews control. They've got the good life, and we have given up everything. And Joseph has dealt with us very harshly. He took advantage of us. He took everything away from us, and we are slaves. So that word comes back to make the people whose ancestors made this happen, now we're going to do it to them.
Okay, good. You brought up a lot of good points, and I saw Nitsa nodding, even though I'm not going to call on her because I'm going to stick to my 3. I might suggest that people use the digital hand raising, because that way you for sure will be called on in order. It's the fairest system that Zoom has. Right, so Sanford pointed out that this might not only be a story that is applicable, right, in times of ancient Egypt, but we might actually see this story repeating itself in history. There's these very powerful individual Jewish figures, the court Jew, right, who end up having a lot of outsized influence in the government. They're kind of outsiders, but they're powerful. And the power, right, then becomes resented, and then it becomes a reason to oppress the Jews. This becomes a kind of like a cycle, right? And you could see this feeding into a trope of Jews having power, Jews having money, right? What, Joseph, the Jew, is the one who invents taxes, right? That's not very good. It's not very flattering, right? So we can actually see that there's something in here that is in some ways like a seed or a germ for a lot of political dynamics that we see repeating itself throughout history, right? And the second thing that Sanford said, which is really important, is that he says, it's very interesting that we see the concept of slavery appearing here. Interesting how the Egyptians were all made to be slaves. And then a couple of chapters later, right, the Jews are all made to be slaves. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that a coincidence? Right, and I'm going to say, if you can't read the tone of sarcasm in my voice, no, I don't think it's a coincidence, okay? Right, whether or not that justifies the behavior of the Egyptians, I happen to be of the opinion that the behavior of the Egyptians was not justified. Certainly, it's understandable, right? And we need to be able to distinguish between justified and understandable. What we're trying to do here is understand how we went from being Joseph's family, living off the fat of the land, not having to work, really just growing and growing and growing in economic status. I don't know if in social status, okay? And then becoming slaves. So there might be this intermediate step where the Egyptians become slaves, and that creates this resentment, right, that then gets flipped onto us. Okay. I'm going to reshare my screen now, and I want you to listen for echoes of the story that we just read in the end of Breshit in the beginning of the story of the enslavement that we're going to read in Sefer Shemot in Exodus, right? Which Sanford has already prompted us with one term, which is slavery. I already prompted you with another term, which is taxes. Okay, and so we're gonna listen closely. We're moving on to Shemot chapter 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household. Reuben, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. Hope these are familiar names. The total number of people born to Jacob was 70. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and that whole generation. But the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Okay, I want you to hear this language, fruitful and prolific. In the Hebrew, Pasuk 7, Paru vayishratzu vayarbu vayatzmu b'me'od me'od. Right, of course, you might recognize some of this language from the Haggadah, but I also want you to see If you scroll back to verse 27 in Breshit, the very last verse in the previous text, we have Vayifru Vayirbu Ma'od, word fruitful and multiplied exceedingly. Okay, so now we have 3 terms that are repeating themselves: slavery, taxes, and this population boom. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us outsmart them, or they will increase. And in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and depart from the land." Therefore, they set taskmasters. Okay, I took this translation from the New Revised Standard Version, which is a Christian text that is like Christian translation that is preferred by academics. But I put in parentheses, right, a more literal translation, which we are going to need. Taskmasters is actually more rightly translated as tax officers. Okay, sarei nisim. Mas is how you say tax in modern Hebrew. You might also remember it from the end of the Megillah that Achashverosh levied a tax on the people. Okay, we're in verse 11 again. Therefore, they set taskmasters, that is tax officers, over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pitom and Ramses for Pharaoh. Okay, here's another word that you might remember. Ramses is where the Jews have been living before. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all of the tasks that they imposed on them. Okay, and here's just another term that I want you to pay attention to. Asher avdu bahem bifarech. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. The word ruthless, farech, has been understood by the rabbis to mean something else than just ruthless. When the rabbis see a word that is not very common and they want to make sense of it, one of the things that they will often do is split it into 2 other words that are more familiar to them. Okay, so the word farech, this kind of crushing word, is actually not a common word in the Bible. So the rabbis split it into 2 words which were more familiar to them: perach, soft mouth or soft speech. And there's a rabbinic tradition that says, were you able to see the screen? Because it said that my screen share was paused. Oh, I'm the worst. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. I'm so sorry. Somebody should have screamed at me to tell me to share my screen again. Okay. What?
I could bring the book.
Okay. And we'll still be okay even if you weren't able to see the text when I was reading it. It was just good oral Torah, as they say. Okay, so the last thing that we were saying, and I'm going to scroll up actually so that you can see all of the highlighted terms, is that the rabbis understood the language of perach, of soft language, right, to be that the Egyptians, right, they kind of sweet talked the Israelites into slavery, or that there was something kind of verbal that was involved in the slavery. Okay, now this is very interesting because the literal meaning of the word perech, right, is the opposite. It means crushing. And then the rabbis understand it when they split it into 2 separate words to mean soft language, right? And I think the proper way to understand how these 2 meanings can live together is that there was something psychologically crushing, okay? The perach, the soft language, right, is soft on the outside and sort of hard on the inside. Okay, So what we're going to do is we're going to go into the main text that I want us to see, because I want us to have time to discuss it once we're done studying it. I'm going to tell you a little bit about where this text was from, and then we're going to dive into it, and then hopefully we'll have enough time at the end to have a fruitful conversation about what this text is saying. So this is a commentary from Rabbi Chaim Ibn Attar, the Or HaChaim. Now, the Or HaChaim now is not a particularly popular commentary. Generally, nowadays, people spend like more of their effort on the medieval commentaries and less on, 17th, 18th century commentaries. But in his day, right after he passed away, he was probably one of the best known commentators and really the most famous and the most revered. One of the reasons why his commentary has fallen a little bit out of favor is because of its length. Okay, the Or HaChaim's commentary is extremely thorough and extremely lengthy. And not to cast aspersions on someone who is, 100 times better than me when it comes to learning and erudition, but I would say his writing style is not always the clearest, right? So if you take a commentary that's very lengthy and very confusing, you could see why over the years it might lose some of its attraction for folks. But the Or HaChaim's commentary is one of my great loves, in part because he is so psychologically astute, so insightful. And we are going to see exactly how he's able to really penetrate into some core psychological truths in his interpretation of the Exodus story. But the way that he does it is through, very close reading and a lot of textual questions. So in order to do right by the Or HaChaim, in order to write by the text of the Torah, we are going to go through some of his strategy, some of his textual strategy for getting to a psychological point. I'm going to try to make it as clear as possible for you. But if, you find that, the next couple of minutes are like a little bit of a slog and you're not 100% following, it's okay. Just bear with me. We are going to get to a conclusion that really you do not want to miss. So just really try to stay focused. And as I mentioned before, in addition to the text of the source sheet, I also have, and I'm going to toggle to this screen, a kind of whiteboard. Okay, and I have already pre-written on my whiteboard a summary of the questions that the Or HaChaim is asking, which he is going to answer in one kind of, grand answer that's going to tie all of the answers to the questions together. So it might be helpful to you to, keep on referring to these questions as I've summarized them. I think it will really help you follow what's happening in the Or HaChaim. So everybody has access in the second link that Barbara shared to the Or HaChaim questions page, which you should feel free to use to help you follow along. And we are going to be going into the text through the source sheet. Okay, I hope that was clear. A new king arose, Vayakam Melech Chadash. Here we go. The straightforward reading yields that as long as one of the prior generation was alive, it would have prevented the enslavement. Okay, so we got to scroll back up to the text in Shemot, where it says in verse 6, Bayamat Yosef v'chol achav v'chol hador hahu. Joseph died and all his brothers and that entire generation. Okay, so the Or HaChaim says it's clear from the fact that the verse tells me that Joseph died and then tells me, all this slavery happens, that the slavery could not have happened until Joseph and that entire generation died. But it would have been sufficient to make that point for the Torah to just have said, Joseph's entire generation died, but the Israelites were fruitful and prolific, etc., etc. Okay, so the Or HaChaim is making a point, and then he's asking a question. The point that he's making is the reason why the Torah includes the detail of the death of Joseph and all his brothers and that entire generation is to show that while they were alive, there was no chance for there to be an enslavement of the Jewish people. Joseph, and it was too powerful. It wasn't going to happen. Okay, that's the point that he's making. And then the question that he's asking about that point is, yeah, but you could have made that point more succinctly, right? And we don't like it when the Torah wastes information, quote unquote, wastes words, right? So why doesn't it just say the whole generation died? Why does it have to specify Joseph's death and the death of Joseph's brothers? Okay, so now we're going to read inside what I just summarized for you. And this is difficult. We're in the third line in the Rabbi Chaim Ibn Attar source. For if it were so, then it would have been sufficient for the verse to say the whole generation died. For if only one member of the generation were alive, there would have been no enslavement. So it did not have to speak of Joseph's death, nor the death of his brothers, right? That information is redundant. Because obviously there would be no death, meaning there would be no slavery, there would be no suffering while they themselves were still alive. Okay, so his claim is something changes when that generation dies. His question is, why am I given the extra information about Joseph and his brothers and then the whole generation? And now he answers. And maybe the verse intends to indicate the following. I'm just going to highlight where I am. Oh no, is that what I meant to do? Okay, that there were stages in the matter of enslavement. Okay, the death of Joseph, the death of the brothers, the death of the whole generation are actually three distinct events that represent three different stages of the process of the Jews becoming enslaved. Because you have to remember, at the end of Reshit, it would seem impossible for the Israelites to be enslaved. Joseph was in charge. His brothers and their whole families were living off of Joseph's largesse in, choice lands in the kind of edges of the country, in the Beverly Hills, Malibu of the country. Okay, and the Egyptians were slaves. Right? So if you were to ask me what happens next, I would say the Egyptians were slaves. I wouldn't say the Israelites were slaves. Okay, so the Or HaChaim, Rabbi Chaim Ibn Attar is telling you, yeah, this verse is indicating that the process of enslavement was gradual. Right? Of course, you couldn't just flip a switch and have the socioeconomic statuses of these people flip. Right? There was actually a gradual change. Okay, where the haves became the have-nots and vice versa. For when Joseph died, here we are, back in the text, for when Joseph died, they lost some of their status. For they were, meaning they had been more elevated than the Egyptians, but then they became equal to them. Okay, so when Joseph died, the Israelites sort of dropped down a rung and they become equal to the Egyptians. And with the death of the brothers, they were demoted again and were beneath the Egyptians, who sneered at them, but didn't enslave them. And with the death of the entire generation, they began to enslave them. And due to their jealousy, right, when they saw the growth of Israel and the way that Egypt was filled with it. Okay, so the first claim that Rabbi Chaim Ibn Attar makes is, let's be real here. It didn't happen overnight. There were stages. First, we were on top. Then we were equal. Then we were less than equal. And then we were slaves. Okay, slippery slope. And now we're going to find out exactly how it happened. How did the Israelites become slaves? This doesn't just happen naturally, right? Something had to happen. Here the child asks, okay, right here he's making a little Haggadah joke. Here the child asks, what was so clever about what they did? This isn't cleverness, just evil and brazenness. Okay, So the first question is, and if we toggle to our Or HaChaim question sheet, we could see question number 2. What was so clever about the way that Pharaoh enslaved the Israelites? So if you go back up to the text in Shemot, you'll see that in verse 10, Paro says, Hava nitchak malo, let's outsmart them. Okay, he is going to outsmart the Israelites and thereby make them slaves. Okay, so the Or HaChaim's first question is, enslaving people isn't outsmarting them, it's just enslaving them, right? It's not cleverness, it's cruelty. Let's not confuse the two. Okay, so question number 1, based on the text in Shemot, is what makes this clever? Okay, I punch you in the face, that's not clever. Okay, so that's the first question. And then we're going to see, right, that the first stage is verse 11. You'll see it's bolded. Therefore, they set tax officers over them to oppress them with forced labor. Okay. And the Or HaChaim is going to ask 2 questions on this verse. The first question is, what are these tax officers? Why are the tax officers the first stage of the oppression? It's a weird term. Sarei misim, tax officers, that's a weird term. And then the second question he has on this verse, on verse 11, is, why does it have to say, lima'an anoto b'sivlotam, in order to oppress them with forced labor? Okay, there's another question here, which is, you know, if I go over to use my very creative example from before, if I go over to you and I punch you in the face, the Torah does not need to narrate that I punched you in the face in order to hurt your face, okay? If I punch you, it's in order to hurt you, right? That is obvious. Okay, so I just want to make sure we understand all of the questions. The first question is, what was the gradual staging that happened from the point of Joseph to the point of the death of the brothers, to the point of the death of the whole generation? We see that it's gradual. How is this gradualness working? That's a kind of overarching question. The smaller questions are, what's so clever about what Pharaoh did? Why do I need to be told that it's in order to oppress them? Isn't it clear that when I enslave someone, it's in order to oppress them? And then the third question, I'm not going in order, but just, you know, I'm going in sort of comprehension order, right? What is the deal with these tax officers? This is a very strange way to get the story started. Okay, I see, Andy, that you've raised your hand. It's already 40 minutes into the class, so I'm going to keep on going with the source, just to make sure that we see the whole thing, and then you'll be first to ask your question when I open up for questions and comments. Okay, so we're going back into the text of Rav Chaim Ibn Attar. Since I already narrated for you what the questions were, we're going to skip a little bit of the text inside and start with, first it was with gentle speech and later with backbreaking labor. Okay, now remember that I sort of highlighted for you that another textual question or another textual weirdness, to use a non-technical term, right? At least according to the rabbis, is that there's some perach, there's some gentle speech that was involved before there was backbreaking labor, or part of the backbreaking labor. There's something that is verbal, and I'm going to add psychological in what is happening. It is not just you lift this heavy thing, it is difficult. Okay, so we can already see actually through the kinds of questions that the Or HaChaim, Rabbi Chaim Ibn Attar, is asking is he wants to know, right, not only politically, how did it go from we were super powerful to we were slaves, although that's an important question. He also wants to know psychologically, right, how did it happen, right? The people who were so powerful allowed themselves to become slaves. How did they truly inhabit the identity of slaves? How did they not notice what was happening? How did this befall us? Okay. And so we're continuing now, and it is implied from the order of the verses. I hope that everybody's following with me. I know that I told Andy that he can't ask us questions, but I pray that we're all following along. Okay, and it is implied from the order of the verses that first they put these tax officers upon them. Okay, tax officers is the first stage. And according to the words of our sages, it must be said that there were words that preceded the placing of the tax officers. And according to what I explained in the verse that states that they thought that they could, I'm going to actually skip this part. So, and we're going to start with, so when the verse says, let us set smart, it can't be about the enslavement, but rather on a different detail. It appears further that when it says to oppress them, that this was unnecessary, for it is evident that they intended to oppress them. And what does with forced labor come to exclude? Okay, just so you can see at the end of this paragraph, these are the questions that I've already told you he's asked. What is so clever here? What is the verbal stage before the tax officer stage? And what is the tax officer stage? Okay, those are really our important questions. Finally, those of you who've been kind of tuning out for the textual piece, tune back in for the psychological piece. Therefore, it appears that they outsmarted them in enslaving them in this manner. For Pharaoh presumably had other builders from among the Egyptians or other people to construct residential cities and other laborers to do the other work that the kingdom requires. Okay, so the first piece of answering, the first puzzle piece is Pharaoh's a rich guy. And technically, he already has an entire nation of slaves. And even if he didn't, he could afford to hire foreign workers. Pharaoh did not need Jewish labor. He did not need the Israelites to become slaves. Okay, he presumably already had workers and slaves. And these people, I'm continuing in the text of the Or HaChaim, and these people, that is the workers and the slaves that Pharaoh already had, are called tax. They are called mas. As the verse says, Solomon, the king, levied a tax from all of Israel. So when King Solomon was building the temple and he needed laborers, when he collected laborers from among the Jewish people, those laborers are called a tax that he levied, right? He levied a tax of people. So the Or HaChaim is saying, when the verse says tax officers in Shemot, the tax that we are referring to is actually laborers, and the officers are the people who are in charge of the tax, who are the laborers. I'm going to say that one more time, and then we're going to read it inside. The Or HaChaim says Pharaoh already had workers.
Is anyone else frozen?
It appears that Dena's internet went out, and she may not even know it.
You can tell because everybody else is moving. So you can tell whether it's their internet or yours.
She's back.
I'm back. My internet cut off. Can everybody hear me? Not if you can hear me. Okay, good. I'm going to just randomly call on Lisa to tell me what's the last thing you heard before I disappeared. You're still muted. Can you unmute
The
yourself?
last thing I heard was regarding the taxes actually being humans.
Okay, great. So that means that I wasn't talking too long while the internet was out. Excellent. Thank you for your help. Okay,
You're
I'm
welcome.
sharing my screen again. Okay, so the last thing that we said is that tax officers refers to people who are in charge of laborers. And now we're at, and he hatched a plan. He is Pharaoh, and he hatched a plan to task Israel that they would be the tax officers, meaning that they would be the ones who are in charge of all who do the king's labor. So the first stage of the enslavement was actually a promotion. Pharaoh said to the Israelites, I've got all these enslaved Egyptians and all these foreign laborers. I need someone to be in charge of them. Would you like to be in charge? I'm back in the text, and this would not be a diminishing or lowering of status of Israel, and they can't refuse it. Okay, it's an offer you can't refuse. Pharaoh said, would you like to be in charge? Would you like to head this committee? Right? And because it's a position of honor, they said yes. Right? They didn't see this as something negative. They saw this as more honor and more power, and of course they said yes. And their intent in this, right, the intent of the Egyptians in doing this is for trickery in order to oppress the people of Israel with the burdens of the taxes. Okay, so the reason why the Torah needs to tell me that the placing of tax officers was in order to oppress the Israelites is because if you just looked at it from the outside, it doesn't seem like oppression, it seems like promotion. Okay, so the Torah needs to tell us, don't think that Pharaoh's being nice and promoting the Israelites and giving them good jobs, management positions. Pharaoh is only doing this in order to oppress the people. And how does becoming a manager lead to this oppression? That when they can't, okay, in order to oppress the people of Israel with the burdens of the taxes, that is the ones who do the labor, that when they, that is the laborers, can't do all of the work that is upon them, given that it exceeds what they can carry, the officers themselves will need to join with them to do the work and fill the quota. Okay, what Pharaoh did is he made the Israelites responsible. You need to produce 100,000 bricks a day. He gives them enough laborers to produce 90,000 bricks a day. And who is going to feel that pressure to fill in what's missing, the extra 10,000 bricks? The Jews, right? So you go from being the manager to being not only the manager, but also a co-laborer, because you feel the pressure that you need to fill the quota. For only the ones who know for the only ones who know the work requirements are the officers, who are the Israelites who are in charge. Okay, and this is the cleverness, that through this trickery, they brought them to the burdens. And this is what our sages meant when they said, with gentle speech, I'm going to promote you. This is going to be good for you. They were officers and then they were laborers. Okay, I'm going to summarize what we just learned, and then I'm going to try to apply it very directly to our lives, and then we should have about 5 minutes for reflection and questions. So the question is, what's so clever about what the Egyptians did? Enslaving people is not so clever. Well, actually, they did it in a very clever way. They did it by telling the Jews, you're going to be in charge. But then the task of being in charge was so overwhelming that the Jews, the Israelites, right, had to actually step in and do the work themselves. Okay, if you've ever been in charge of a project and you know that this happens, that you somehow are supposed to be delegating, but you end up doing the vast majority of the work, okay? And then at some point, the managers, right, the tax officers are building the cities, and slowly but surely, all of the Egyptians go on a coffee break, okay? And the only people that are left laboring are the Israelites themselves, okay? And so the gentle speech is the means by which Pharaoh convinces the Israelites to put themselves in a position where they will eventually become slaves, okay? The way that he does it, right, and I think this is sort of very psychologically difficult, right, and insightful of the Or HaChaim to notice this, right, is what he says is, it doesn't even start as something compulsory. It starts as an offer. You can be in charge. And the Israelites say, us? We're going to be in charge? Well, that totally fits our understanding of ourselves as privileged and better. And therefore, of course, we're going to be in charge of these projects. Then once they start to feel responsible, then they start to do the labor themselves. And then the people who are supposed to be doing the labor can sort of start to trickle away. Anybody here who has ever been in a situation where they have been in power and have been in charge has had some version of this experience, right? Where you end up doing all of the work, even though you're not supposed to. You end up doing all of the work because you're the person who knows the most. You're the person who feels the most passionate. And then, it starts to get away from you. Now, I think that Rabbi Chaim Ibn Attar is not telling you not to be a manager. I think part of what he's telling you in the way that he describes what happens is he's giving you some suggestions, implied suggestions, I will suggest, for how to not get into this situation. Okay, the first thing that he says is, and the Israelites, right, the ones who are in charge, the ones who are the managers, are the only ones who know what the quota is and how much work needs to be done. Okay, you can flip that into advice, right? That maybe, but the managers aren't going to be the only ones who feel urgency if they're not the only ones who know how much work needs to be done. Okay, right? So if you, as a person who is in charge or a person who feels most passionate, is able to transmit the information and is able to transmit the passion, you will not be in a position where you find yourself doing all of the work. Okay, that's, I think, the first implicit suggestion in the Or HaChaim's description, right? And then the second element is that the Or HaChaim says these managers, these tax officers, the only possible solution that they could think of for their problem of, I only have 90,000 laborers worth bricks and I need to produce another 10,000 bricks, is to do it themselves. Okay, there's another option that the manager, when they're sunk in to this difficult situation, doesn't see, and that is going to Pharaoh and saying, listen, I only have enough laborers to produce 90,000 bricks. You either have to reduce the quota or increase the number of laborers. Okay, when you are inside the problem and you are feeling stressed, right, our automatic instinct is, well, then I have to do it myself, and then I have to do more, and I have to make sure that it's all taken care of, me. Okay, and that is, according to the Or HaChaim, a recipe for enslaving yourself. Instead, you have to take a step back and say, what is realistic here? What is reasonable? Can I go back to my Pharaoh and change the scope of the project? And I think this is a particularly difficult and a particularly important thing for us to be able to do when we're the Pharaoh and the tax officers, right? How much Passover cooking am I planning to do? I'm the one who makes the menu. And then when I find out that I'm staying up till 2 a.m. peeling potatoes, right? The answer is either wake up my kids and tell them to help me peel some potatoes, or maybe we're not going to have pugel this year because it's not reasonable for a human being to be up at 2 a.m. peeling potatoes for the Festival of Freedom. Okay, so I really want you to understand that this is both, very clever reading of how the Israelites went from being very high echelon of society to being slaves, how it's gradual and how you don't notice, and right, that it comes through appealing to their kind of arrogance, right? Their sense of self and their sense of it's reasonable for me to be in charge, right? So there's that, but there's also us. We're also enslaved all the time, right? By the responsibilities that are given to us and the responsibilities that we take on. And something that is a great opportunity at the beginning, right, can become a really crushing burden at the end. And I think the Or HaChaim is inviting us to look at the little slaveries in our lives and evaluate, maybe we don't need to be slaves in that way, right? Maybe we can ask for help, and maybe we can diminish the workload if we're just willing to take a step back and evaluate the situation with kind of outside eyes. So with our last couple of minutes, I just want to take any lingering questions or reflections on this text. I know it was very frontal, but we only had an hour, and I really wanted to make sure that we saw this text, which I think is very special and very insightful. So I'm going to start with Andy, who's been very patiently raising his virtual hand, and then we'll take other comments as time allows. Yes, Andy.
Well, I raised my hand earlier when I thought you were ready to take questions. And it's been so long and so good since then. I really don't think I remember what that particular question was or what my answer was. But I do have an overall observation. I've put some comments in the chat, that other people may have seen already. But I wanted to also share the idea that goes along with this analysis that the Israelites really allowed themselves to be enslaved. They contributed to their own slavery, but from my perspective, it wasn't that they were fooled into it, and it wasn't that there were soft words, and it wasn't about being given responsibility and then just having to get it all done. I think that's a wonderful, something I would have never thought about, probably gender related, but it never occurred to me. But my idea was that after being in Egypt all that time and seeing that all the Egyptians did this forced labor seasonally, building pyramids and obelisks and whatnot, that as they became less Israelitish and more Egyptian, they wanted to fit in. They were feeling permanent. They were feeling less like immigrants. And if everybody else is volunteering to build pyramids, we should too. And I think that part of the way that gets you into slavery is your sense of fairness can seduce you, into a different kind of slavery, but, you can wind up in the same place. And that's the seduction of communism and socialism and some of those sorts of things that, this push to be like everybody else and doing what everybody else is doing, it also can lead to a kind of slavery. So that's my overall observation. But I loved your teaching today because the psychological, I turn around and say, well, if we're going to cut anything out, we shouldn't kosher so hard for Pesach.
Okay.
So do the potatoes, boil less silverware.
So everybody has their own, religious calculus about what's more important. I would, personally
Of course.
choose to have a kosher Pesach over a very elaborate Seder. But I do want to connect your comment to the Or HaChaim's reading. And then I also just want to acknowledge that, we're at time. If folks want to stay on, I'm happy to continue to respond and ask questions, but I just want to be respectful of people's time. And I know that time is up and I'm formally ending now. just that I think that also, you know, your sense of, well, the Israelites decided to join along with the Egyptians to labor with them because they felt bad for the Egyptians. A, I don't think that's particularly likely, but B, let's assume that it is likely and it did happen, right? Again, there might have been another way for them to solve that problem, right? Instead of saying, oh, the Egyptians are working so hard, I'm also going to work hard with them. Maybe they could have said, I'm going to use my position of privilege and power to go to Pharaoh and say, let these people go, right? The labor that they're doing is unreasonable. Pay them or give them a lighter load, right? And so I think that even your reading, right, points to what is true about all of us, that we often have a lack of creativity, right? When it comes to solving a problem, instead of, you know, trying to totally shift the paradigm, we just try to like lend a hand, right? And sometimes that could actually be much more damaging. And taking a step back and really evaluating the situation and being willing to take a stand towards changing the situation could actually be, you know, in the short run, seem, you know, kind of pointless, but in the long run, right, much more helpful. Okay, so I do want to, it's 3 minutes past time. If anybody has a really urgent question or comment, I will certainly take it. But I do just want to say thank you so much for learning with me. It was great to have an opportunity to learn with some folks that I haven't had a chance to learn with before. If you have any questions or, you know, follow-up thoughts, you could definitely email me at weiss@hadar.org. I'll chat out my email address. I'm on parental leave, so I might not be too quick to respond, but I will respond eventually. And also go to hadar.org to check out all the amazing things the Machon Hadar is doing. We have a Pesach reader. We have videos for how to kosher your kitchen. There's really a lot going on at Hadar all year round, but particularly in advance of Pesach. And I really invite you to see everything that Hadar has to offer. So I'm going to chat out my email address, which is also in the source sheet, and check us out.
Dena, thank
Thank
you.
you
This
so
was
much.
really fascinating.
Yeah, I didn't expect to get management advice, but it makes total sense. Thank you.
Unfortunately, we're all slaves.
I never looked at that first text that way. It's something I don't think we've examined carefully. So that was really open eye to that.
I'm glad.
I passed over it before.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dena. I'll be in touch.
All right,
care.
take care, everyone.
Bye.
Happy Passover.
You too.